England, 1665. Empty streets. Church bells toll for the dead. A young man is sent home, locked away from the world. But in that silence, Isaac Newton is about to reinvent the universe. The air smells of death. This is not a metaphor. It's the literal scent seeping through the streets of London, snaking through the alleyways of Cambridge, permeating every corner of a crumbling nation. It's the smell of unburied bodies, of houses marked with red crosses, of entire families vanishing overnight. It's the smell of bubonic plague, the Great Plague, which at this very moment is erasing more than 100,000 souls from existence. The streets are empty. No markets. No processions. No life as they knew it. Only the rhythmic, ghostly sound of death carts rolling through the streets at dawn. "Bring out your dead," cry the gravediggers, voices turned mechanical, stripped of humanity after weeks of hauling corpses like sacks of grain. Death has become routine. Survival a lottery. In Cambridge, the university gates close. Trinity College, that bastion of knowledge that for centuries has shaped England's brightest minds, now stands vacant. The hallways that once echoed with philosophical debates now hear only the echo of their own ghosts. The libraries, those temples of accumulated wisdom spanning generations, are sealed. Professors have fled to their rural estates. Students have been sent back to their homes if they still have homes to return to. Knowledge is going dark. Not gradually but suddenly, like a candle drowned in wax. And with it, something deeper extinguishes: certainty. Humanity, which had barely begun to glimpse the laws governing the universe, which had only just started questioning centuries of Aristotelian and theological dogma, is forced to retreat, to hide, to wait for the storm to pass. A humanity trapped between fear and superstition. Because in 1665 science is not what we know today. There's no universally accepted scientific method. No academic journals to publish discoveries. No systematic way to distinguish verifiable knowledge from mystical speculation. Alchemy still blurs with chemistry. Astrology with astronomy. Magic with medicine. It was a world without light. Without visible laws. A world where apples fell because it was their nature to fall, where the moon remained in the sky because God had ordained it so, where every natural phenomenon was a mystery wrapped in superstition, explained by dogma, accepted without question. But amid this absolute chaos, amid this darkness threatening to swallow every trace of human progress, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will change everything. While death stalked Cambridge, a young man locked in a farmhouse was about to reinvent the universe. To understand the magnitude of what's coming, we must first understand the abyss from which we emerge. England in 1665 is not just a sick country. It's a wounded country, traumatized, fractured to its core. Barely 2 decades earlier, the nation tore itself apart in brutal civil war. King Charles I was executed in 1649, his head severed from his body before a crowd at Whitehall, an act of regicide that sent shockwaves throughout Europe. For 11 years, England was a Puritan republic under Oliver Cromwell's iron fist, a period of extreme religious austerity where theaters were shuttered, celebrations banned, joy considered sinful. Then in 1660 the monarchy was restored. Charles II returned from exile. But the wound remained open, festering. Executions continued. Purges too. The distrust between Catholics and Protestants was palpable, violent, lethal. And now the plague. As if England hadn't suffered enough, as if the country needed one more proof that God had turned his face away, the bubonic plague arrived from Amsterdam in the spring of 1665. It began in London's poor districts, in the overcrowded areas along the Thames, where rats infested the docks and fleas jumped from body to body with lethal efficiency. The symptoms were horrific. Fever that burned the skin. Swollen buboes in the armpits and groin, the size of eggs, oozing black pus. Delirium. Gangrene. Within days, sometimes hours, death. There was no treatment. No cure. No hope. By summer, London was losing 1,000 people per week. By September, that number had climbed to 7,000. The rich fled to the countryside. The poor stayed behind to die. Mass graves were dug in church courtyards. Bodies were piled 6 feet deep, covered with quicklime, and another layer added the next day. The economy collapsed. Trade stopped. Ships refused to dock at English ports. Merchants went bankrupt overnight. The Royal Exchange closed. Workshops shuttered. The bustling commerce that had made London one of Europe's great cities simply ceased to exist. But the economic crisis was merely the surface wound. The deeper injury was psychological, spiritual, existential. People didn't understand why the plague struck. Some blamed God's wrath for the nation's sins. Others blamed Catholics or Jews or foreigners. Quack doctors sold useless remedies, amulets inscribed with magic words, potions made from crushed toads, instructions to smoke tobacco constantly to ward off bad air. The word quarantine came from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. The period families were sealed in their homes if anyone showed symptoms. Guards were posted outside to ensure no one left. If you ran out of food, you starved. If the healthy caught the disease from the sick inside, they died together. The scientific understanding of disease was virtually non-existent. The dominant theory was still based on the ancient Greek concept of miasma, bad air, foul vapors rising from swamps and refuse that carried illness. The idea that microscopic organisms could cause disease was decades away from acceptance. The role of rats and fleas wouldn't be understood for another 2 centuries. Doctors wore bizarre bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, believing pleasant aromas would protect them. It didn't work. They died alongside their patients. This was the intellectual landscape, ignorance masquerading as knowledge. And it extended far beyond medicine. The entire framework of human understanding was built on foundations of sand. In physics, Aristotle still reigned supreme. His ideas, written nearly 2,000 years earlier, taught that the Earth was the unmoving center of the universe. That heavy objects fell because they sought their natural place at the Earth's center. That the heavens were made of a perfect, unchanging substance called quintessence, fundamentally different from earthly matter. That violent motion and natural motion were separate phenomena governed by separate principles. These weren't just academic theories. They were the lens through which educated people viewed reality itself. In astronomy, despite Copernicus and Galileo, most people still believed the sun revolved around the Earth. The Church had forced Galileo to recant his heliocentric views just 30 years earlier, in 1633. He died under house arrest, his works banned. The message was clear. Challenge the established order of the cosmos and you challenge God himself. Mathematics was primitive by modern standards. Calculus didn't exist. The mathematical tools needed to describe motion, change, and rates of variation simply weren't available. Algebra was still considered exotic, recently imported from the Islamic world. The idea that nature could be described by mathematical equations was barely imaginable to most scholars. This was the intellectual prison in which humanity found itself trapped. Without science, the world was a collection of poorly understood miracles. Every thunderstorm was an act of God. Every comet was an omen. Every illness was divine punishment or demonic possession. The line between natural and supernatural didn't exist because there was no concept of natural law, immutable mathematical principles governing all phenomena. The human condition was one of helpless ignorance dressed up as received wisdom. People lived their entire lives never traveling more than 20 miles from where they were born. Life expectancy was roughly 35 years. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Nearly half of all children died before age 5. Women frequently died in childbirth. Injuries that today would require simple antibiotics were death sentences. A cut could become gangrenous. A tooth infection could kill you. And through it all, there was no framework for understanding why. Why do things fall? Why do the planets move? Why does the moon orbit the Earth but never crash into it? Why do tides rise and fall? Why does an arrow fly in an arc? These questions, which seem simple now, were profound mysteries then. The greatest minds of the age could offer only circular reasoning. Things fall because it's their nature to fall. The moon stays in the sky because it's made of celestial substance. Tides rise because, well, some connection to the moon perhaps, but the mechanism was utterly unknown. The universe was a locked box. And humanity was scratching at the outside, trying to peer through cracks, making up stories about what might be inside. Into this darkness, into this desperate ignorance, into this world dying of plague and drowning in superstition, a single mind was about to strike a match. A mind that would illuminate not just England, not just Europe, but the entire cosmos. A mind that would reveal the hidden architecture of reality itself. But that mind was trapped in a body. A human body. With human flaws, human fears, human demons. The ancient question haunted every philosopher who ever looked up at the stars. Why does anything stay in motion? This wasn't idle curiosity. This was the fundamental puzzle of existence. Aristotle had taught that objects naturally came to rest unless continuously pushed. This seemed obvious. A cart stops when the horse stops pulling. An arrow falls when its initial force is exhausted. Everything in human experience suggested that motion required constant cause. But then what about the heavens? The planets never stopped moving. The moon circled endlessly. The stars wheeled through the night with perfect regularity year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. If motion required a mover, what kept the celestial spheres in perpetual rotation? The medieval answer: angels. Literally. Invisible celestial beings pushing the planets along their courses, doing God's work, keeping the cosmic machinery running. This is not a joke. This was serious scholarship. By the 17th century, the angel theory had fallen out of favor among natural philosophers, but nothing had replaced it. Descartes proposed that invisible vortices of cosmic fluids swept the planets along. Kepler suggested magnetism. Others invoked various forms of celestial virtue or vital force. All of them were groping in the dark, trying to solve a problem they couldn't properly formulate because they lacked the conceptual tools. The core issue was this: humanity didn't understand that there was anything to understand. They saw falling objects and planetary motion as completely separate phenomena. The terrestrial and celestial realms were different worlds governed by different principles. An apple dropping from a tree had nothing to do with the moon's orbit. Gravity, though they didn't use that word, was earthly. The heavens were ruled by different laws, or perhaps by no laws at all, just divine will. This fragmentation of reality into separate, unconnected pieces was the essential obstacle to progress. Why do things fall? In 1665, the best answer educated people could give was, because they're made of earth, and earth seeks its natural place at the center of the universe. Heavy objects fall faster than light objects because they have more earthiness. Fire rises because it seeks its natural place in the celestial spheres. This explanation satisfied almost no one, but alternatives were hard to come by. Galileo had done crucial experimental work. He'd rolled balls down inclined planes and discovered that all objects, regardless of weight, accelerate at the same rate when falling in the absence of air resistance. This demolished Aristotle's claim that heavy objects fall faster. He'd also observed Jupiter's moons and seen that they obeyed regular, predictable patterns, evidence that celestial objects followed natural laws rather than angelic whim. But Galileo couldn't explain why objects fell. He could describe how, the mathematics of acceleration, but not the cause. He'd opened a door but couldn't step through it. Kepler had made even more remarkable discoveries. By painstakingly analyzing decades of astronomical observations made by Tycho Brahe, he determined that planets move in ellipses, not circles. He discovered 3 mathematical laws describing planetary motion with stunning precision. But he too couldn't explain the underlying cause. Why ellipses? What force guided the planets along their paths? He speculated about some kind of emanation from the sun, growing weaker with distance, pushing the planets like sunlight pushing a sail. He was wrong about the mechanism, but right that there was a mechanism to be found. By 1665, the pieces of the puzzle were scattered across Europe, held by different thinkers who didn't quite realize they were working on the same problem. The search for order had become desperate. Because without understanding the principles governing motion, humanity was helpless. Navigation was guesswork. Engineering was trial and error. The trajectories of cannonballs couldn't be calculated. The motion of the tides couldn't be predicted with accuracy. The calendar itself was a mess because the movements of the sun and moon couldn't be precisely forecasted. But the desperation went deeper than practical concerns. Humans need to believe the universe makes sense. We need to feel that there's order beneath the chaos, meaning behind the randomness. Without that belief, we're adrift in a cosmos that's fundamentally incomprehensible, where anything can happen for no reason, where today's certainties can vanish tomorrow. The plague reinforced this existential dread. If God or nature or whatever governed the world could unleash such horror without warning or reason, what did that say about the universe we inhabited? It was a question as ancient as curiosity itself. Why does everything fall? Not just objects, but empires, hopes, bodies during plague time, kingdoms during war. Everything descended, spiraled downward, returned to earth. Was there meaning in this universal tendency? Was there a law hidden beneath the obvious? Or was falling just another inexplicable fact of existence, like death, like suffering, like the apparent randomness of who survived the plague and who didn't? The hunger for certainty in a collapsing world was overwhelming. People were dying by the thousands, nations were tearing themselves apart, and the educated elite couldn't even explain why a stone dropped from a tower accelerated as it fell. The gap between human ambition and human knowledge had never been more painful. We could build cathedrals but couldn't explain echoes. We could navigate by stars we didn't understand. We could pray to a God whose universe remained fundamentally mysterious. And into this void, this desperate need for answers, this world crying out for someone to make sense of the chaos, stepped a young man who would do exactly that. But first, he would have to survive isolation. He would have to confront his own demons. He would have to fail repeatedly, spectacularly, until he learned how to succeed. His name was Isaac Newton, and in the summer of 1665, as the plague closed Cambridge and sent him home, he was 23 years old, unknown, unremarkable, and about to change everything. He was born on Christmas Day, 1642, in a small manor house in Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire. His father, also named Isaac, had died 3 months before his birth. The infant was so premature and tiny that his mother, Hannah, reportedly said he could fit inside a quart mug. No one expected him to survive. But he did. A fatherless child in a world where fathers were everything, where inheritance and identity flowed through the male line, where being born without a father was a mark of shame and vulnerability. His mother remarried when Isaac was 3. Her new husband, a wealthy rector named Barnabas Smith, didn't want a stepson. So Hannah left young Isaac with his grandmother and moved to a nearby village to start a new family. She had 3 more children with Smith. For 7 years, from age 3 to 10, Isaac lived without his mother. She was 3 miles away but might as well have been on another continent. He saw her occasionally, briefly, as a visitor rather than a parent. The psychological impact of this abandonment cannot be overstated. In one of his notebooks, the adolescent Newton compiled a list of sins, and among them was this entry, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The rage of a rejected child, burning so hot it survived into his teenage years, recorded in his own hand. He never forgot. He never forgave. When Barnabas Smith died in 1653, Hannah returned with 3 half-siblings Isaac barely knew. The family was reunited, but the damage was done. Isaac had learned to live inside his own head, to trust no one, to expect nothing from others. Solitude wasn't just comfortable for him. It was safety. It was home. He was a mediocre student at first. Quiet, withdrawn, more interested in building mechanical devices than studying Latin. He constructed windmills, water clocks, sundials. He carved his initials and drawings into every surface he could reach. His uncle recognized something in the boy, some spark of unusual intelligence, and convinced Hannah to send him to Cambridge in 1661. She wanted him to be a farmer, to manage the family estate. But Isaac couldn't manage sheep without losing half of them to wandering. His mind was always elsewhere, calculating, imagining, constructing. At Cambridge, he was a subsizor, essentially a servant student who paid reduced tuition by serving wealthier students their meals and cleaning their rooms. It was humiliating. He was brilliant but poor, intellectually curious but socially invisible. He read voraciously, Descartes, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, ancient geometry, modern philosophy. He filled notebook after notebook with ideas, questions, criticisms of established theories. He was teaching himself mathematics years ahead of what was officially taught. By 1664, he had mastered most of what Cambridge could offer him. And then, in the summer of 1665, the plague arrived. The university closed. Students scattered. And Isaac Newton, 23 years old, was sent back to Woolsthorpe Manor, the house where he'd been born and abandoned, to wait out a pandemic that would kill a quarter of London's population. He expected to be there for a few months. He ended up staying for 18 months, through 1665 and most of 1666. What he did during those 18 months would lay the foundation for modern physics, modern mathematics, and modern astronomy. In isolation, while death ravaged England, while the world seemed to be ending, this weird, angry, brilliant young man would see further than any human had seen before. He would discover not one but three revolutionary ideas: the nature of color and light, the mathematics of change known as calculus, and universal gravitation. Any one of these would have made him one of history's great minds. He did all three before his 25th birthday. But that triumph was still ahead. In June 1665, as Newton packed his books and papers and prepared to leave Cambridge, he was just another frightened student fleeing a plague. The genius was there, coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to spring. The isolation would be that moment. The absence of distractions, the lack of formal obligations, the silence of a country manor during a pandemic, these would be the conditions that allowed his mind to roam freely across problems that had stumped humanity for millennia. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to have the most productive 18 months in the history of human thought. He was about to discover that the universe spoke mathematics, that the same force that made apples fall also kept the moon in orbit, that nature wasn't a collection of separate mysteries but a single, unified system governed by laws that could be written down, tested, and verified. He was about to show humanity that we didn't have to be helpless before the universe. We could understand it. We could predict it. We could, for the first time, truly know where we were and what we were part of. But first he had to go home. Back to the place where his mother had left him. Back to the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Back to isolation. And there, in that silence, surrounded by fields and trees and nothing else, Isaac Newton would discover gravity. Woolsthorpe Manor sits in the middle of nothing. It's a modest limestone farmhouse, gray and weathered, surrounded by fields that stretch to the horizon in every direction. No neighbors within shouting distance. No town, no church, no inn where travelers gather to share news. Just crops, livestock, orchards, and sky. In 1665, when Isaac Newton returns here as the plague consumes England, it's one of the loneliest places a person can be. The silence hits him first. At Cambridge there was always noise. Students arguing in the courtyards, bells marking the hours, the constant murmur of academic life. Here there's nothing. The wind through barley fields. Birds. The occasional lowing of cattle. His own footsteps on stone floors. The silence isn't peaceful. It's oppressive, almost physical, a weight pressing down on everything. His mother is here, of course. Hannah Newton, now Hannah Smith, widow for the second time. She runs the household with Puritan efficiency. Prayers at dawn, work until dusk, rigid adherence to routine and scripture. She doesn't understand her son. Never has. To her, he's a perpetual disappointment. A man who should be managing the family estate but instead wastes his time with books and strange devices. She tolerates his presence but doesn't celebrate it. His half-siblings are here too. Benjamin, Mary, and Hannah Smith, children of his mother's second marriage, the marriage that excluded him. They're younger, strangers really, and they give him a wide berth. They've heard the stories about Isaac's temper, his brooding silences, his tendency to explode over minor interruptions. They leave him alone. Which is exactly what he wants. Newton takes over a room on the upper floor, converts it into a workspace. He hauls up his books from Cambridge, dozens of them, forbidden Copernican texts, Descartes' geometry, Galileo's dialogues. He brings his papers, thousands of pages of notes and calculations. He sets up a makeshift laboratory, prisms he's made from glass, mirrors, candles for experiments with light, crude instruments for measuring and observing. The room becomes his world. He emerges for meals, barely speaking, eating mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. Then back upstairs, the door closing, the sound of pacing. Hours of pacing. His footsteps were grooves in the floorboards, back and forth as his mind churns through problems. Sometimes his family hears him talking to himself, rapid muttering in a language of mathematics and philosophy they can't understand. The neighbors think he's gone mad. There are whispers in the village. Young Newton locked in that room doing God knows what. Some suspect witchcraft. Others think the plague has addled his brain even though he shows no symptoms. A few, more charitably, assume he's simply odd, one of those bookish types who can't function in the real world. None of them imagine that inside that room, inside that head, a revolution is taking place. Because while the world outside is dying, while England counts its dead by the thousands, while fear and superstition reign supreme, Newton is creating the future. He's not trying to. He doesn't wake up thinking, today I'll invent modern physics. He's just following his curiosity, pursuing problems that fascinate him, trying to understand things that don't make sense. But his curiosity is uniquely powerful, his mind uniquely suited to see patterns others miss, connections others can't imagine. He starts with light. It's a problem that's bothered him for years. Why do prisms create rainbows? The conventional wisdom, going back to Aristotle, is that prisms somehow modify white light, adding color to it through the thickness of the glass. Newton suspects this is wrong. He sets up experiments, covering the windows with boards, admitting only a thin beam of sunlight through a small hole. He places a prism in the beam and watches the spectrum splash across the opposite wall. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Beautiful. But why? He isolates a single color from the spectrum, passes it through a second prism. If Aristotle is right, if prisms add color, the second prism should change the color further. It doesn't. Red stays red. Blue stays blue. The implication stuns him. White light isn't pure. It's a mixture. The prism doesn't create color, it reveals the colors already hidden in sunlight. White is composite. Color is fundamental. This is revolutionary, though it'll be years before anyone realizes it. Newton has just overturned 2,000 years of optics. But he doesn't celebrate. He just moves to the next problem. He's insatiable, driven by a hunger to understand that borders on pathological. He can't leave questions unanswered. Can't accept conventional wisdom. Has to verify everything himself, push every idea to its limits, test it until it breaks or proves true. Next, mathematics. He's been struggling with a problem. How to calculate the area under a curve. It sounds abstract, academic, but it's crucial for understanding motion. If you know how fast something is moving at every instant, how do you calculate the total distance it's traveled? Conversely, if you know the position at every instant, how do you calculate the speed and acceleration? The existing mathematical tools are inadequate, clumsy, limited to specific cases. So Newton invents new tools. He develops what he calls the method of flux ions, a mathematical technique for handling continuous change. It's the beginning of calculus, though he doesn't call it that yet, and it'll be one of the most important mathematical innovations in history. With this tool, he can describe motion precisely. He can write equations for acceleration, for curves, for rates of change in any system. It's like developing a new sense, a way of seeing the world that wasn't possible before. And then, gradually, inevitably, he comes to the big question. The question that's haunted him since he first studied astronomy at Cambridge. The question that's haunted humanity since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered, why do the planets move the way they do? What keeps them in their orbits? What prevents them from flying off into space or crashing into the sun? He paces his room hour after hour, day after day, thinking about Kepler's laws. The planets move in ellipses with the sun at one focus. A line from the sun to a planet sweeps out equal areas in equal times. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the sun. These are beautiful mathematical relationships, but they're descriptive, not explanatory. They tell you what happens but not why. Newton senses there's a connection between planetary motion and falling objects. It's not obvious. No one else has seen it. But there's something nagging at him, some intuition that these are related phenomena. An apple falls toward Earth. The moon orbits Earth but never falls. Why the difference? Is it really a difference, or are they the same thing seen from different perspectives? He works the problem from every angle. He calculates, sketches diagrams, fills page after page with attempts to bridge the gap between terrestrial and celestial mechanics. Nothing quite works. The mathematics is difficult. His tools aren't quite adequate yet. He's missing something, some key insight that will make everything click into place. The frustration builds. This is the pattern of Newton's mind. Obsessive focus, absolute dedication, but also crippling perfectionism. He can't accept partial answers. Can't be satisfied with approximations. Everything must be exact, complete, irrefutable. This makes him brilliant but also tortured. He drives himself mercilessly, sleeps little, eats less, exists in a state of constant mental tension that would break most people. While the world fled from death, he fled toward ideas. But ideas are demanding masters, especially for someone like Newton. They consume him. They possess him. He disappears into problems for days at a time, emerging hollow-eyed and trembling, his body neglected, his mind aflame. His family learns not to disturb him. They slide food outside his door, leave it there, come back hours later to find it untouched. There's something almost frightening about the intensity of his focus. It's not normal. It's not healthy. But it's also undeniably powerful. Newton's ability to concentrate, to hold complex ideas in his head for extended periods, to pursue problems with absolute single-mindedness, this is both his superpower and his curse. He can't stop. He doesn't know how to stop. The problems pull him deeper and deeper until he's lost in realms of abstraction most humans never glimpse. But beneath the genius, beneath the revolutionary insights, there's a damaged human being. A man who was abandoned by his mother. Who threatened to burn down his stepfather's house. Who has no friends, no confidants, no one he trusts enough to share his thoughts with. His isolation at Woolsthorpe isn't just physical. It's emotional, psychological, existential. He's alone in the deepest sense, trapped inside a mind that's both his greatest gift and his prison. The demons are always there. The rage that never quite goes away. The conviction that others are out to steal his ideas, undermine his work, claim credit that belongs to him. He's paranoid with good reason. The academic world is vicious, competitive, filled with men who would happily take another's discovery and present it as their own. But Newton's paranoia goes beyond reasonable caution. It's visceral, consuming. He sees threats everywhere, slights and innocent comments, conspiracies and honest questions. And then there's the religious guilt. Newton is a Puritan, raised in a tradition that sees sin everywhere, that demands constant self-examination and repentance. He keeps lists of his sins, meticulously recorded. Threatening his parents. Idle thoughts during sermons. Setting his heart on worldly things. Making pies on Sunday night. Punching his sister. Having unclean thoughts about women. The list goes on, a catalog of minor transgressions that he elevates to cosmic significance. He's terrified of damnation. Terrified that his intellectual pursuits are distracting him from God. Terrified that his pride in his own abilities is the worst sin of all. The same mind that can revolutionize physics also tortures him with religious doubt. Is he serving God by trying to understand creation, or is he committing the sin of pride, presuming to know what only God should know? The question gnaws at him. He experiments on himself with alarming recklessness. Wanting to understand vision, he stares directly at the sun until his eyes burn, until he has to spend days in darkness recovering. He takes a bodkin, a thick needle, and slides it between his eyeball and the eye socket, pressing on the back of his eye to see how it affects his perception of color and shape. The pain must be excruciating, but he records his observations with clinical detachment. He's willing to damage himself in pursuit of knowledge. This is not the sanitized Newton of textbooks. This is not the serene genius calmly discovering laws of nature. This is a tormented, obsessive, dangerous man, brilliant beyond measure but also deeply unwell. His genius and his madness are inseparable, two faces of the same intense consciousness that can't bear ignorance, can't tolerate mystery, must understand or die trying. The experiments with light continue. He's no longer satisfied with simple prisms. He wants to understand everything about optics, about reflection and refraction, about the nature of vision itself. He builds a telescope, grinding and polishing the mirrors himself with painstaking precision. Most telescopes of the era use lenses, but lenses create distortions, color fringing that blurs the image. Newton designs a reflecting telescope that uses mirrors instead. It's a radical innovation and it works beautifully, producing clearer images than telescopes many times larger. But even this success doesn't satisfy him. He can't just make a discovery and move on. He has to understand it completely, explore every implication, test every variation. He fills notebooks with diagrams and calculations, working out the mathematical relationships governing light and color. He's creating the science of optics from scratch, building on Kepler and Descartes but going far beyond them, establishing principles that will stand for centuries. And through it all, the big question keeps pulling him back. Gravity. The force that makes apples fall and planets orbit. He can't let it go. It's become an obsession, the central problem around which all his other work revolves. He senses he's close to something profound, some insight that will unify everything, but he can't quite grasp it. The frustration is maddening. He tries different approaches. What if the force that pulls things down also extends upward, out into space? What if it reaches the moon? But then why doesn't the moon fall? He calculates the moon's motion, works out how far it falls toward Earth in each second of its orbit. The number is tiny compared to how fast an apple falls, but it's not zero. The moon is falling just very slowly in a curved path that keeps missing the Earth. The orbit is a continuous fall. The idea is staggering. It suggests that falling and orbiting are the same thing, that the moon is no different from a thrown stone except in the details of its motion. If you could throw a stone fast enough horizontally, it would fall around the Earth instead of down to it. At sufficient speed it would orbit. The distinction between earthly and celestial motion dissolves. They're unified by the same principle, governed by the same force. But the mathematics don't quite work. Newton calculates what the gravitational force should be based on the moon's distance and motion, and the numbers don't match his predictions. He's using the best available measurements of the Earth's size, the moon's distance, but something's off. The discrepancy bothers him intensely. Is his theory wrong? Are the measurements inaccurate? He doesn't know, and not knowing is torture. So he sets the problem aside. Not because he's giving up, but because he knows he needs better data, better tools, more time. This is Newton's method. Pursue a problem until he hits a wall, then turn to something else while his subconscious keeps working on it. He'll come back to gravity later when he has what he needs. For now, there are other mysteries to solve. Failure is everywhere in his notebooks. Pages crossed out, calculations abandoned, theories tried and discarded. For every insight that works, there are dozens that don't. The process is messy, frustrating, humbling. But Newton has a quality rare among geniuses. He learns from failure. Each dead end teaches him something. Each mistake narrows the range of possibilities. He's building toward truth by eliminating everything that isn't true, a slow, painful process of refinement. His mother doesn't understand any of this. To her, he's wasting time that should be spent on the farm. The estate needs management. The crops need attention. But Isaac can barely be bothered with such mundane concerns. He tries occasionally to supervise the workers, but his mind wanders. He's thinking about parabolas while sheep escape through broken fences. He's calculating the trajectory of projectiles while the harvest rots. He's useless at practical matters, brilliant at abstract ones. The tension in the household is palpable. Hannah resents her eldest son's impracticality. Isaac resents his mother's inability to see what he's doing, the importance of his work. They barely speak except when necessary. The emotional distance established in his childhood has never closed. They're strangers living in the same house, bound by blood but not understanding, obligated by family but not connected by love. His half-siblings learn to avoid him. When Isaac is working, the entire household tiptoes around, speaking in whispers, careful not to interrupt. His temper is legendary. Once, when a servant disturbed him during a crucial calculation, Newton screamed at the man for 15 minutes, a torrent of rage completely disproportionate to the offense. The servant quit. Others learned to stay away. Isolation breeds more isolation. The more time Newton spends alone with his thoughts, the less able he becomes to interact with others. Social skills atrophy. The normal give and take of human relationship feels impossible. He can spend hours explaining a mathematical concept to an imaginary interlocutor in his head, but can barely string together a sentence in actual conversation. His inner world is vivid, complex, infinitely rich. His outer world is barren, reduced to the minimum necessary for survival. The plague continues through 1665 and into 1666. The death toll climbs. London burns in September 1666, the Great Fire consuming huge portions of the city, and people wonder if this is the apocalypse, if God's judgment has finally arrived. But at Woolsthorpe, life continues in its strange, isolated rhythm. Newton barely notices the outside world. He's too absorbed in his own universe, the one inside his skull where ideas collide and new laws emerge. Every failure is a brick in the cathedral of his understanding. This is the paradox of innovation. You must fail extensively to succeed occasionally. Most people give up when they fail. They take it as evidence that they're on the wrong track, that the problem is insoluble, that they should pursue something easier. Newton never gives up. Failure makes him angry, frustrated, but not deterred. If something doesn't work, he tries another approach. And another. And another. His stubbornness is almost pathological, but it's also what makes him capable of solving problems others find impossible. He experiments with mechanics, rolling objects down inclined planes as Galileo did, but with greater precision. He times their descent, measures their acceleration, tries to find the mathematical relationship between distance, speed, and time. He works with pendulums, varying their length, their weight, their amplitude, looking for patterns. He studies collisions between objects, trying to understand how motion is transferred, how momentum is conserved. All of this is building towards something, though he doesn't yet see the full picture. He's assembling tools, developing mathematical techniques, gathering empirical data, all of which will be necessary when the moment of synthesis arrives. The genius isn't in any single insight but in the patient accumulation of knowledge, the willingness to pursue problems for months or years, the refusal to accept easy answers or conventional wisdom. And then, in the summer of 1666, probably in August or September though the exact date is uncertain, it happens. The moment that will become legend, that will be told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until the truth is almost impossible to separate from the story. Newton is in the garden at Woolsthorpe, not working for once. Just sitting, thinking, letting his mind wander. The apple trees are heavy with fruit. It's been a good year for apples despite everything else going wrong in England. An apple falls. This part is almost certainly true. Newton himself mentions it in later life, though he gives few details. Maybe it falls near him. Maybe he sees it out of the corner of his eye. Maybe it actually hits him, though that's doubtful. What matters is not the physical apple but what it triggers in his mind. A connection. A sudden, shocking realization that reorganizes everything he's been thinking about for months. If the apple falls because Earth attracts it, pulls it downward with a force we call gravity, then why shouldn't that same force extend beyond the surface? Why shouldn't it reach up to the clouds, to the mountaintops, to the moon itself? The moon is falling toward Earth just like the apple, but it's moving sideways fast enough that it keeps missing, falling around Earth instead of into it. The orbit is a balance between the moon's sideways motion and its continuous fall toward Earth. If that's true, then the same force that makes apples fall also keeps the moon in orbit. The same force. The terrestrial and celestial unified at last. Not two different phenomena but one, operating everywhere, governing everything from pebbles to planets. The implication is staggering. There's a universal force of attraction between all masses, a force that reaches across the void of space, that operates according to mathematical principles that can be discovered and tested. Newton's mind races. If gravity acts on the moon, it must act on all the planets. The force must depend on distance somehow, because the moon falls more slowly than an apple despite being far more massive. Maybe the force decreases with distance. But how? Proportionally? Inversely? as the square of the distance? He needs to calculate to test his intuition against the data. He returns to his room, grabs paper and quill, starts working through the mathematics. If the force of gravity follows an inverse square law, meaning it decreases with the square of the distance, then the moon's orbit should follow Kepler's third law automatically. The mathematics will predict the relationship between orbital period and distance without needing to treat them as separate phenomena. Everything will follow from a single principle: universal gravitation obeying an inverse square law. The calculations are difficult. He's still developing his mathematical tools, still learning how to handle the complexities. But gradually, painfully, the pieces fit together. The same equation that describes an apple falling describes the moon orbiting. The same principle that governs falling stones governs the planets around the sun. There's no distinction between earthly and heavenly physics. It's all one system, one set of laws, one universe. That question divided history in two. Before this moment, humanity saw the cosmos as fundamentally divided: the corrupt, changing earth below, the perfect, eternal heavens above. After this moment, that division becomes untenable. The universe is unified, governed by laws that operate everywhere the same way. We're not at the center of a special realm. We're on a planet, one among many, all following the same rules, all subject to the same forces. This is the moment of synthesis. Everything Newton has learned about mathematics, about motion, about celestial mechanics, comes together. The failures, the false starts, the months of frustration, they were all necessary. You can't have this insight without first understanding calculus, without mastering Kepler's laws, without thinking deeply about the nature of motion and force. The apple is the trigger, but the real work was done in the months and years leading up to this moment. For the first time in human history, the universe obeys an equation. Not a metaphor. Not a theological principle. An actual mathematical equation that predicts how objects move, how forces act, how the cosmos operates. You can write it down. F equals gmm2 over r squared. The force between two objects equals the gravitational constant times their masses divided by the square of the distance between them. Simple. Elegant. Universal. This equation governs everything. Apples falling from trees. The moon orbiting Earth. Earth orbiting the sun. The tides rising and falling. Planets moving in ellipses. Comets sweeping through the solar system. All of it, every motion in the heavens and on Earth, following one law, describable by one equation. The implications are almost too large to grasp. Newton sits in his room, surrounded by papers covered in calculations, and realizes what he's done. He's uncovered the hidden architecture of the cosmos. He's revealed the mechanism behind planetary motion. He's unified physics in a way no one has before. The feeling must be extraordinary, terrifying, overwhelming. To see so clearly, to understand so deeply, to hold in your mind the mathematical structure of reality itself. But he tells no one. This is crucial to understanding Newton. He makes one of the greatest discoveries in human history and he keeps it to himself. He doesn't publish, doesn't announce it, doesn't even mention it to his Cambridge professors when he returns to the university in 1667. He just files his calculations away, makes some notes, and moves on to other problems. What? Partly fear. He's afraid of criticism, of having his ideas attacked or stolen. Partly perfectionism. The calculations aren't quite right yet. He's still using inaccurate measurements of Earth's size. The numbers don't perfectly match his predictions. Until everything is perfect, until every objection is anticipated and answered, he won't share. And partly isolation. He's been alone so long, worked in such secrecy, that he doesn't know how to share ideas, doesn't trust anyone enough to reveal what he's thinking. So the greatest scientific discovery of the century sits in a drawer in Woolsthorpe Manor, known only to its creator, while the world continues in ignorance. It'll be 20 years before Newton publishes his theory of universal gravitation, 20 years before humanity learns that the universe makes sense, that motion and force follow comprehensible laws, that we can predict the future behavior of celestial objects with mathematical certainty. But the seed is planted. The insight is achieved. The revolution has begun even if no one else knows it yet. Isaac Newton, 24 years old, isolated in a farmhouse during a plague, has seen deeper into the nature of reality than anyone before him. He's discovered that the universe is not a mystery. It's a machine. A beautiful, precise, mathematically perfect machine. And he's figured out how it works. The universe left behind mystery and became a system. That's the achievement. That's what changes everything. Before Newton, nature was fundamentally incomprehensible, full of inexplicable phenomena that could only be accepted on faith. After Newton, nature becomes knowable, predictable, subject to laws that human reason can discover and understand. The shift is profound, irreversible, world-changing. He doesn't realize it yet, but he's just ended the medieval worldview. The cosmos of angels and celestial spheres, of earth-centered perfection and heavenly mystery, is finished. In its place comes the mechanical universe, the clockwork cosmos, the system of masses and forces operating according to eternal mathematical laws. God might have created it, but he did so by establishing principles that never change, that can be studied and verified by human investigation. This is the birth of modern science. Not just physics, but the entire scientific worldview. The conviction that nature is lawful, that those laws can be discovered through observation and mathematics, that human beings can comprehend the universe without appealing to supernatural explanations. Newton doesn't set out to create this worldview. He's just trying to understand why apples fall. But in answering that simple question, he opens a door that can never be closed again. The mathematics are beautiful in a way that transcends aesthetics. Newton sits at his desk through the autumn of 1666, refining his equations, testing his theory against every piece of astronomical data he can find. The inverse square law of gravitation explains everything. Why the planets move faster when closer to the sun. Why their orbits are elliptical rather than circular. Why the tides rise twice daily. Why objects accelerate as they fall. One principle, infinite applications. He calculates the force between Earth and Moon. The numbers work mostly. There are small discrepancies, but he attributes them to measurement errors in the Earth's radius and the Moon's distance. The fundamental principle is sound. Every mass in the universe attracts every other mass. The force is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Simple. Elegant. True. But it raises profound questions. How does this force work? How does Earth pull on the Moon across 93 million miles of empty space? There's no rope, no chain, no physical connection. The force acts instantaneously across a void. Newton finds this philosophically troubling. Action at a distance seems impossible, almost magical. Yet the mathematics demand it. The evidence confirms it. Gravity reaches across space somehow, operating according to strict mathematical laws but through no mechanism he can identify. He leaves the mechanism unexplained. This is important. Newton discovers the law of gravity but doesn't pretend to explain what gravity is or how it operates. He describes its behavior precisely but admits ignorance about its nature. I frame no hypotheses, he'll write later. He's interested in what happens, not why it happens at the deepest level. The math works. The predictions match observations. That's enough. This approach will define modern physics. You don't need to understand the ultimate nature of a force to use it, to predict its effects, to build technology around it. You need accurate mathematical descriptions. You need testable predictions. You need experimental verification. The rest is philosophy, interesting but not essential. Newton establishes this principle. Describe nature mathematically, test your descriptions against reality, and don't worry too much about metaphysical questions you can't answer. The implications cascade outward. If gravity operates everywhere according to the same law, then the universe is fundamentally comprehensible. There are no arbitrary exceptions, no regions where different rules apply, no mysteries that must forever remain mysterious. You can figure out how things work. You can write down equations. You can make predictions that will prove accurate decades or centuries into the future. This is revolutionary not just scientifically but philosophically. It means human reason is adequate to understand the cosmos. We're not dependent on divine revelation or ancient authority. We can investigate nature directly, test hypotheses, discover truth through observation and mathematics. The universe is knowable and we're capable of knowing it. That's the real revolution Newton triggers. Not just a law of physics, but a new relationship between humanity and the cosmos. Consider what this means for prediction. Before Newton, astronomical tables were rough approximations based on centuries of observation and ad hoc adjustments. Predicting planetary positions required consulting complex tables that worked reasonably well for the near future but grew increasingly inaccurate over time. After Newton, you can calculate planetary positions centuries in advance with extraordinary precision. You can predict eclipses, conjunctions, transits. You can send a spacecraft to Jupiter and know exactly where Jupiter will be when the spacecraft arrives years later. Or consider engineering. Before Newton, calculating trajectories was guesswork informed by experience. Cannoneers learned through trial and error how to aim, adjusting for distance and wind but unable to predict precisely where a shot would land. After Newton, trajectory calculations become possible. You can determine the parabolic path of any projectile. You can optimize angles for maximum range. You can turn warfare into a mathematical exercise. The same principle that governs falling fruit governs everything that moves. Balls, arrows, bullets, moons, planets, stars, galaxies. All obeying the same law, all predictable with the same mathematics. Newton hasn't just solved one problem. He's revealed that all problems of motion are fundamentally the same problem. Once you understand gravity and inertia, once you can write equations for forces and accelerations, you can predict any motion anywhere. But in 1666, none of this is public knowledge. Newton has made his discovery, worked through the mathematics, verified the principle against available data. And then he files it away. The notebooks go in a drawer. He mentions nothing to anyone. When Cambridge reopens in 1667 and he returns to continue his studies, he carries this secret with him, this knowledge that he's uncovered the operating system of the universe, and he says nothing. The return to Cambridge is jarring after 18 months of isolation. The plague has receded. The university is cautiously reopening. Students and faculty trickle back, wary but hopeful that the worst is over. Newton arrives with his papers, his calculations, his revolutionary insights, and immediately finds himself back in the rigid structure of academic life. Lectures, examinations, social obligations. All the things he's terrible at, all the things that constrained him before the plague. But something has changed. He has changed. The isolation has transformed him from a promising but unremarkable student into something unprecedented. He's developed mathematical tools no one else possesses. He's conducted experiments no one else has conceived. He's solved problems that have stumped the greatest minds in Europe. He's 24 years old and he's already accomplished more than most natural philosophers achieve in a lifetime. Yet he remains invisible. He doesn't announce his discoveries, doesn't seek recognition, doesn't try to impress his professors. He just continues working quietly, obsessively, expanding his insights, refining his theories. He completes his degree in 1668 and is elected a Fellow of Trinity College in 1669. It's a comfortable position. Housing, salary, access to the library, no obligations except some teaching. Perfect for someone who wants to pursue research without interference. His work on optics gets noticed first. He's built that reflecting telescope and it performs remarkably well. Word spreads. In 1671, he demonstrates the telescope to the Royal Society in London, the premier scientific institution in England. They're impressed. They make him a member. They ask him to write up his optical theories for publication in their journal, Philosophical Transactions. This is Newton's first real engagement with the wider scientific community. He writes a paper explaining his experiments with prisms, his discovery that white light is composite, his theory of color. The paper is brilliant, revolutionary, clearly written. He submits it in 1672, expecting appreciation, recognition, perhaps some technical questions. What he gets instead is criticism. Harsh criticism. His theory is attacked from multiple angles. Robert Hooke, the curator of experiments at the Royal Society, writes a scathing response. Others pile on. They question his methods, dispute his conclusions, propose alternative explanations. Newton is devastated. He thought he'd proved his case beyond doubt. The experiments are reproducible. The mathematics are sound. The conclusions are inescapable. How can these people not see it? The criticism feels personal, malicious. He's convinced that Hooke and others are motivated by jealousy, by a desire to steal his ideas or diminish his achievement. He writes bitter responses, defending his work with increasing vehemence. The controversy drags on for years. Newton grows to hate it. Hate the conflict, the misunderstandings, the need to defend obvious truths against ignorant critics. He seriously considers never publishing anything again, just working in isolation, pursuing knowledge for its own sake without having to engage with the frustrating, infuriating world of academic politics. The Royal Society has to beg him to continue submitting papers. He does, reluctantly, but the experience poisons him against public scientific discourse. This is crucial for understanding why the theory of gravity remains unpublished for so long. Newton has no desire to subject himself again to the kind of criticism his optical work received. He knows gravity is even more radical than his theory of color, even more likely to provoke controversy. He's discovered that the heavens and earth obey the same laws, that action at a distance is real, that the entire universe operates according to mathematical principles. These ideas will be attacked. He'll be accused of reviving occult forces, of undermining religion, of arrogance in thinking he can explain divine creation. So he stays silent. He continues working on gravity privately, refining the mathematics, exploring implications. He shares some results with a few trusted correspondents but publishes nothing. The greatest scientific achievement of the age exists only in his notebooks and in his mind. The world continues operating under Aristotelian assumptions, Cartesian vortices, theological explanations. And Newton lets it happen because he can't bear the thought of defending his discovery in public. But his work is expanding in other directions. He's fascinated by alchemy, spends years conducting alchemical experiments, trying to transmute base metals into gold, searching for the philosopher's stone. To modern eyes, this seems like a waste of his genius. How can the man who discovered universal gravitation also believe in alchemy? But for Newton, there's no contradiction. He's searching for hidden principles, secret knowledge about the nature of matter. Alchemy is just another form of investigation, another way of probing reality's secrets. He's also obsessed with biblical prophecy and chronology. He writes hundreds of thousands of words analyzing scripture, trying to date ancient events precisely, interpreting prophetic visions. This isn't casual interest. It's another obsession pursued with the same intensity he brings to physics. He believes that understanding sacred history is as important as understanding natural law. Both reveal God's plan. Both require rigorous analysis and mathematical precision. The genius who revolutionizes physics is also a man of his time, embedded in 17th century beliefs and assumptions. He's not a modern rationalist. He's a deeply religious Puritan who sees scientific investigation as a form of worship, a way of understanding God's creation. His alchemy and biblical scholarship aren't distractions from his real work. They are his real work, as important to him as gravity or optics. We remember him for physics because that's what still matters 3 centuries later, but he spent more time on theology and alchemy than he did on mechanics. The conflict with Robert Hooke intensifies. Hooke claims that he suggested the inverse square law to Newton, that Newton's theory of gravity is built on Hooke's insights. There's some truth to this. Hooke did speculate about inverse square forces before Newton published. But speculation isn't proof. Hooke couldn't do the mathematics. He couldn't derive Kepler's laws from gravitational principles. He couldn't predict planetary motions. Newton could. The difference between vague hypothesis and rigorous proof is everything. But Newton can't let the slight go. He's paranoid about credit, convinced that others are trying to steal his achievements. His response to Hooke is venomous. He writes letters attacking Hooke's competence, his character, his understanding of physics. The dispute becomes personal, bitter. These are not dispassionate scholars disagreeing about technical matters. These are rivals who hate each other, who see intellectual disagreement as personal warfare. The genius attracts not only light but shadows. Newton's brilliance makes him enemies. His inability to compromise, his refusal to credit others, his conviction that he's always right, these qualities alienate colleagues and create conflicts that last decades. He's not content to be right. He needs his enemies to be wrong, publicly humiliated, their ideas exposed as inferior. It's not enough to win. His opponents must lose completely. In 1684, everything changes. The astronomer Edmund Halley visits Cambridge to ask Newton a question. What curve would a planet describe if it was attracted to the Sun by a force inversely proportional to the square of its distance? Newton answers immediately, an ellipse. Halley is stunned. How does Newton know this? Newton says he's calculated it. Halley asks to see the calculation. Newton can't find it, promises to send it later. This is the moment. This casual question from Halley triggers the event that will finally bring Newton's work on gravity to the world. He sits down to recreate the calculation for Halley and ends up writing a 9-page treatise. Then the 9 pages expand to dozens. Then hundreds. The work pours out of him, 18 years of accumulated insights, refined mathematics, comprehensive analysis. He's writing the Principia, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, the book that will establish the framework for physics for the next 2 centuries. The work consumes him. He forgets to eat, to sleep, to maintain even basic hygiene. His servants find him in the morning still dressed in yesterday's clothes, papers everywhere, mumbling about ellipses and gravitational forces. He teaches his lectures disheveled and distracted, sometimes speaking to an empty room because he didn't notice the students left. He's producing the most important scientific work of the millennium, and it's destroying him physically even as it fulfills him intellectually. Halley becomes his champion, his editor, his advocate. Halley recognizes the magnitude of what Newton is producing, understands that this work will change everything. He encourages Newton, negotiates with publishers, pays for printing costs out of his own pocket when the Royal Society balks at the expense. Without Halley, the Principia might never have been published. Newton would have written it and then filed it away as he filed away so much else. The Principia is published in 1687 in Latin, in a small printing that almost no one can afford or understand. It's dense, mathematical, written in a geometric style that's already archaic. Newton deliberately makes it difficult, partly to demonstrate rigor and partly to keep it out of the hands of what he considers mathematical incompetents who will misunderstand and criticize. The book is brilliant but almost unreadable except to the most sophisticated mathematicians. It lays out the laws of motion. Inertia, force equals mass times acceleration, action and reaction. It presents the law of universal gravitation. It derives Kepler's laws from gravitational principles. It explains the tides, the precession of the equinoxes, the shape of Earth, the motion of comets. It provides mathematical tools for calculating planetary positions, predicting eclipses, understanding every form of motion in the heavens and on Earth. The impact is slow but inexorable. At first, few people read it. Fewer understand it. Continental philosophers, especially Cartesians, reject it. Action at a distance seems absurd. How can Earth pull on the moon without touching it? Where's the mechanism? The criticism Newton feared materializes. But this time he has Halley and others to defend the work. And gradually, as astronomers use Newton's methods and find they work, as predictions prove accurate, as the mathematical power of the approach becomes undeniable, resistance crumbles. By the early 18th century, Newtonian physics dominates in England. By mid-century, it dominates everywhere. The continental philosophers give up their vortices and embrace gravitation. Newton becomes a legend in his lifetime, celebrated as the greatest natural philosopher since Aristotle, the man who finally explained the machinery of the cosmos. He's knighted in 1705, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. He's appointed Master of the Royal Mint, a prestigious and lucrative position. He's President of the Royal Society. He's famous, wealthy, powerful. But he's also old, increasingly isolated, still obsessed with priority disputes and theological studies. He never marries, never has close friends, never finds peace. The demons that drove him to greatness still torment him. He rewrites history to diminish Leibniz's role in inventing calculus. engaging in a bitter priority dispute that lasts until Leibniz's death. He uses his position at the Royal Society to attack rivals and promote loyalists. He's petty, vindictive, unable to forgive or forget slights real and imagined. The return to the world never fully succeeds. Newton emerges from his isolation to share his discoveries, but he never becomes comfortable in society, never learns to collaborate effectively, never develops the human warmth that would make him beloved as well as respected. He's admired but not liked, celebrated but not understood. The man remains as enigmatic and troubled as ever, even as his theories reshape civilization. The world Newton helps create is fundamentally different from the one he was born into. Within decades of the Principia's publication, the impact is visible everywhere. Navigation improves dramatically. With accurate tables of lunar positions calculated from Newtonian mechanics, ships can determine their longitude at sea, reducing shipwrecks and opening new trade routes. The British Navy becomes dominant partly because British navigators have better tables, better predictions, better understanding of orbital mechanics. Astronomy becomes a precise science. Observatories spring up across Europe, equipped with increasingly sophisticated instruments, staffed by mathematicians trained in Newtonian methods. They map the heavens with unprecedented accuracy. They discover new celestial objects, predict their motions, test Newton's laws against observations. Every test confirms the theory. Every prediction proves accurate. The success is overwhelming, undeniable. Engineering advances rapidly. Understanding forces and motion allows for better bridge design, more efficient machinery, improved fortifications. The Industrial Revolution, which begins in the mid-18th century, is built on Newtonian foundations. Steam engines, water wheels, mechanical looms, these all embody principles of force, motion, and energy that Newton elucidated. You can't build reliable machinery without understanding mechanics, and Newton provided that understanding. The clockwork universe becomes the dominant metaphor for reality. If planets follow mathematical laws with perfect precision, if every motion can be predicted from initial conditions, then perhaps everything is predetermined. Perhaps the universe is a vast machine, set in motion by God and thereafter running according to immutable laws. Human free will, moral responsibility, the role of divine intervention, all become philosophically problematic in a Newtonian cosmos. This leads to the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the conviction that human rationality can solve any problem. If Newton could decode the heavens, surely other thinkers can decode society, politics, economics, human nature itself. Apply reason, discover laws, build systems. The 18th century becomes intoxicated with this vision. Newton didn't just discover physical laws. He created a template, a methodology, a worldview. The impact extends to philosophy. John Locke and Newton were contemporaries and friends. Locke's empiricism, his conviction that knowledge comes from experience rather than innate ideas, parallels Newton's experimental approach. Voltaire champions Newton in France, contrasting Newtonian clarity with Cartesian obscurity. Kant's philosophy is explicitly an attempt to reconcile Newtonian physics with human freedom and moral law. Enlightenment thought is unimaginable without Newton. In economics, Adam Smith's invisible hand echoes Newton's gravity, an unseen force producing order from individual actions. In political theory, the idea of natural law gains new credibility. If nature has laws discoverable by reason, perhaps society does too. The American and French revolutions are inspired partly by Newtonian confidence that rational analysis can determine the best form of government. Newton not only discovered a law but discovered a way of thinking. The scientific method as we know it, experimental investigation combined with mathematical analysis, rigorous testing of hypotheses, peer review and publication, all crystallize in the generation after Newton. The Royal Society becomes a model for scientific institutions worldwide. Universities establish physics departments, teaching Newtonian mechanics as the foundation of natural philosophy. The technology that follows is staggering. Telescopes improve, revealing nebulae, binary stars, the structure of the Milky Way. Clocks become extremely accurate, necessary for precise astronomical observations and navigation. Surveying techniques advance, enabling accurate maps and property boundaries. The entire infrastructure of modern civilization rests on technologies enabled by Newtonian physics. From every rocket launched to every satellite orbiting Earth, from GPS systems to space telescopes, from ballistic missiles to golf balls, everything that moves through space obeys Newton's laws. When NASA calculates trajectories to Mars, they're using equations Newton wrote 3 centuries ago. When engineers design roller coasters, they're applying principles Newton discovered. The physics he created in isolation at Woolsthorpe Manor during a plague now governs trillion-dollar industries. But there's darkness too. Every discovery illuminates and casts shadows. Every advance creates new problems even as it solves old ones. Newton gave humanity unprecedented power over nature, and we've used that power for purposes he never imagined, some beneficial, many horrific. The same physics that sends satellites into orbit also sends bombs onto cities. The same understanding of trajectories that enables space exploration also enables ballistic missiles. The military applications come quickly. By the 18th century, artillery is becoming a science. Calculations based on Newtonian mechanics allow for precise targeting. Navies use physics to optimize cannon design, to calculate range and accuracy, to turn ships into floating artillery platforms. The effectiveness of European military technology, built on scientific understanding, enables colonialism. Superior guns, better ships, more accurate artillery, these allow relatively small European forces to conquer vast territories. The Industrial Revolution, enabled partly by Newtonian mechanics, transforms society but also exploits workers, ravages environments, creates unprecedented inequality. Factories use machines designed with principles Newton elucidated, but those machines are operated by children working 16-hour days in dangerous conditions. The wealth generated by industrial technology concentrates in the hands of owners while workers starve. Newton didn't intend this, couldn't have predicted it, but his work made it possible. The clockwork universe metaphor has troubling implications. If everything is predetermined, if humans are just complex machines operating according to physical laws, what happens to moral responsibility? To free will? To the soul? Materialist philosophy, the conviction that reality consists only of matter and motion, gains credibility from Newton's success. If physics can explain the cosmos, perhaps it can explain consciousness, morality, meaning. Perhaps these are illusions, ephemera produced by matter following mathematical laws. This reductionism troubles many thinkers. If Newton is right, if the universe is just particles and forces, where is God? What role does divinity play in a cosmos that runs automatically according to eternal laws? Deism emerges, God as clockmaker who designed the universe and then left it to run itself. But deism slides easily into atheism. If God doesn't intervene, if prayer doesn't affect outcomes, if miracles are impossible in a lawful universe, why believe in God at all? Newton would be horrified by this trajectory. He saw his work as glorifying God, revealing the divine intelligence behind creation. But others use his work to undermine religion, to argue that science and faith are incompatible, that rational investigation renders theology obsolete. The conflict between science and religion, which becomes so bitter in the 19th and 20th centuries, has roots in Newton's success. The environmental consequences are profound. Understanding nature's laws enables exploitation on unprecedented scales. Mining, deforestation, industrialization, all proceed with greater efficiency because physics allows for better tools, more powerful machines, systematic extraction of resources. The earth begins to be seen as raw material, resources to be exploited rather than a living system to be respected. Newton didn't cause environmental destruction, but the worldview his work helped create, the vision of nature as mechanism rather than organism, contributed to humanity's willingness to treat the natural world as infinitely exploitable. Colonialism and imperialism used Newtonian science as justification. European nations consider themselves more advanced because they understand physics, astronomy, mathematics. This supposed superiority justifies conquering other peoples, exploiting their resources, imposing European culture and governance. Scientific racism emerges, attempts to use biology and anthropology to prove European supremacy. Newton's physics doesn't directly support these ideologies, but the success of European science becomes entangled with arguments for European dominance. The same knowledge that enables us to explore the cosmos also enables us to destroy ourselves. Nuclear weapons are built on physics that extends but doesn't contradict Newton's laws. The Manhattan Project scientists were using quantum mechanics and relativity, but they were still applying force equals mass times acceleration, still calculating trajectories, still using mathematics Newton pioneered. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed hundreds of thousands and ushered in an era of existential threat. Every weapon system since, from intercontinental ballistic missiles to drone strikes, applies physics Newton helped establish. Every discovery illuminates and also projects shadow. This is not Newton's fault. He couldn't have foreseen these applications. But it's naive to celebrate scientific achievement without acknowledging the costs, the unintended consequences, the dark uses to which knowledge is put. Newton discovered how the universe works. He didn't determine how humanity would use that knowledge. We did that. We continue to do that for better and worse, every day. Newton dies in 1727 at the age of 84, famous, wealthy, revered across Europe as the greatest natural philosopher who ever lived. His funeral is a state affair. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, among kings and poets, the first scientist accorded such honor. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Let mortals rejoice that there has existed such and so great an ornament of the human race." Not a scientist. An ornament. A treasure. A proof of what humanity can achieve. But his legacy isn't the wealth or the titles or the tomb in Westminster. His legacy is the entire structure of modern science. Every physics textbook starts with Newton. Every engineering student learns his laws of motion. Every calculation of trajectory, every analysis of forces, every prediction of planetary positions, builds on foundations Newton laid. He didn't just make discoveries. He created a framework that's lasted 3 centuries and counting. Consider what students learn in their first physics course. Newton's 3 laws of motion. The law of universal gravitation. The equations relating force, mass, and acceleration. The principle that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. These aren't historical curiosities. They're working tools used every day by engineers, physicists, astronomers, anyone who needs to predict how objects move or forces interact. When NASA plans a mission to Mars, they start with Newton. The trajectory calculations, the orbital mechanics, the gravitational assist that slingshot spacecraft around planets to gain speed, all Newtonian physics. When civil engineers design skyscrapers, they calculate forces and stresses using principles Newton established. When app developers create physics engines for video games, making virtual objects move realistically, they're implementing Newton's equations. The predictions work. That's what matters. That's what makes Newton's achievements so profound. He didn't just propose interesting ideas. He discovered laws that actually govern reality, that produce accurate predictions decades, centuries, millennia into the future. You can calculate where Jupiter will be on January 1, 2100, using Newton's laws, and when 2100 arrives, Jupiter will be there. That's extraordinary. That's unprecedented in human history. But Newton's legacy is also the recognition that scientific understanding is provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges. In 1905, Albert Einstein publishes his special theory of relativity, showing that Newton's laws are approximations, accurate at everyday speeds but breaking down as velocities approach the speed of light. In 1915, Einstein's general relativity reinterprets gravity itself, not as a force but as the curvature of spacetime caused by mass and energy. Does this mean Newton was wrong? No. It means Newton was right within a certain domain. His laws work perfectly for everyday phenomena, for planetary motion, for anything moving much slower than light. Einstein's theories extend to extreme cases, very high speeds or very strong gravitational fields, but they reduce to Newtonian physics in normal conditions. Newton's equations are still used for most practical purposes because they're simpler and accurate enough. This is how science progresses. Not by discarding old theories completely but by understanding their limits, finding where they work and where they break down, developing more comprehensive theories that explain both the successes and failures of previous models. Newton's mechanics is the foundation. Relativity and quantum mechanics are extensions, addressing phenomena Newton couldn't have observed with 17th-century technology. Einstein reportedly said, "Newton, forgive me." He recognized that general relativity displaced Newton's theory of gravity, but he also recognized the debt. Without Newton, without the framework of mathematical physics Newton established, Einstein couldn't have made his discoveries. You have to walk before you run. Newton taught humanity to walk, to describe nature mathematically, to test theories against observation. Einstein ran with those lessons, but the path was blazed by Newton. The continuity of the search is what matters. From Aristotle to Galileo to Kepler to Newton to Einstein to Hawking and beyond, each generation building on previous insights, each discovery enabling the next. Newton stands at a crucial junction in this progression, the moment when physics becomes truly mathematical, truly predictive, truly powerful. He's not the end of the story. He's the beginning of the modern chapter. The legacy extends beyond physics. Newton demonstrated that human reason is adequate to comprehend nature, that we're not condemned to ignorance, that patient investigation and mathematical analysis can unlock the universe's secrets. This epistemological confidence, this conviction that knowledge is possible, transforms civilization. The modern world, with its technology and science, its material abundance and intellectual achievements, is built on Newtonian foundations. Space exploration is impossible without Newton. Every satellite orbiting Earth, every probe sent to distant planets, every telescope placed in orbit, exists because we understand orbital mechanics. The International Space Station circles the planet at 17,000 miles per hour, held in orbit by the same gravitational principles Newton discovered while watching apples fall. Astronauts floating in microgravity are experiencing Newton's first law, inertia, the tendency of objects to maintain constant velocity unless acted on by external forces. GPS systems depend on Newtonian physics and Einsteinian corrections. The satellites orbit at precise altitudes, moving at precise speeds, their positions calculated using equations Newton wrote. Your phone can tell you your location within feet because we can predict satellite positions with extraordinary accuracy, a direct consequence of understanding gravity and motion. Every time you navigate using GPS, you're benefiting from Newton's plague year in Woolsthorpe. The legacy is embedded in the infrastructure of modernity. Transportation systems, from cars to airplanes to rockets, are designed using Newtonian mechanics. Communication systems, from telephone networks to the internet, rely on technology developed through scientific understanding Newton helped establish. Medical devices, from imaging equipment to surgical robots, embody physical principles Newton elucidated. The modern world is unimaginable without the revolution Newton sparked. But the legacy also includes the questions Newton couldn't answer, the mysteries that remain. What is gravity? Why does mass attract mass? Newton described the law but couldn't explain the mechanism. Einstein showed that gravity is spacetime curvature, but that just pushes the question deeper. Why does mass curve spacetime? Quantum mechanics and general relativity remain incompatible at fundamental levels. The search for a unified theory, a complete understanding of reality, continues. Newton would appreciate that. He never claimed to have answered everything, never pretended his theories were final truth. He saw himself as standing on the shoulders of giants, building on work done by others, contributing his piece to an ongoing endeavor. In a letter to Hooke, despite their bitter rivalry, Newton wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." It's one of his most famous quotes, and it captures something essential about science: the cumulative, collaborative nature of the enterprise. Everything launched toward the sky, from rockets to dreams, obeys Newton. That's literal. The equation for escape velocity, the speed needed to break free of Earth's gravity, comes from Newton's laws. 11 kilometers per second, 25,000 miles per hour, that's how fast you must travel to reach space permanently. Every rocket that achieves orbit, every probe that escapes Earth, every human who's left the planet, has done so by reaching velocities Newton's equations specify. But it's also metaphorical. Our aspirations, our ambitions, our attempts to transcend limitations, these too are constrained by reality, by natural laws, by the universe as it actually is rather than as we wish it were. We can dream of anything, but achieving those dreams requires understanding how things work, respecting physical constraints, working within the laws of nature. Newton showed us those laws. He defined the boundaries of the possible. His work continues in classrooms worldwide where students learn physics, in laboratories where researchers push the boundaries of knowledge, in the minds of anyone who looks at the night sky and wonders how it all works. The questions Newton asked, the methods he developed, the conviction that nature is comprehensible, these form the core of the scientific worldview that now dominates global civilization. For better and worse, we live in Newton's world. Yet Newton himself, the man behind the achievements, remains enigmatic. In his final decades, after the Principia's publication, after the acclaim and the knighthood, after establishing himself as the preeminent scientist in Europe, Newton becomes increasingly strange. He's appointed Master of the Royal Mint in 1696, a position he takes seriously, personally investigating counterfeiters, sending some to be hanged. He's efficient, effective, ruthless. But his heart isn't in monetary policy. His true passions remain alchemy and theology. He spends more time on these pursuits than on physics or mathematics. His alchemical experiments continue, attempts to transmute metals, to discover the secret of the philosopher's stone, to unlock hidden properties of matter. His theological writings multiply, massive manuscripts analyzing biblical prophecy, attempting to date creation precisely, interpreting apocalyptic visions. He writes more than 1 million words on religion and alchemy, far more than on physics. To modern observers, this seems baffling. How can the man who discovered universal gravitation also believe in transmuting lead to gold? But for Newton, there's no contradiction. Both are searches for hidden truth, attempts to decode the secrets God embedded in creation. He sees nature and scripture as two books written by the same author, both requiring patient study and rigorous analysis. His alchemy is empirical, experimental, based on observation. His theology is analytical, mathematical, seeking patterns and principles. He's also increasingly isolated. He never married, never had romantic relationships as far as historians can determine. Whether this was due to religious conviction, lack of interest, or psychological barriers, we don't know. He had a few close friendships, mostly with younger men who admired him, but these relationships were intellectual rather than intimate. He shared ideas but not feelings, collaborated on research but not on life. The old age is lonely. He lives in London in a comfortable house, served by his niece Catherine Barton, who acts as his housekeeper and social facilitator. She's charming, popular, everything Newton isn't. Through her, he maintains some connection to society. But he's fundamentally alone, still the isolated boy from Woolsthorpe, still the student who preferred books to people, still the man who trusts no one completely. His health declines. He suffers from kidney stones, a painful condition that torments his final years. He continues working when he can, revising his published works, writing on theology and chronology, engaged in the disputes over priority that obsess him. The conflict with Leibniz over who invented calculus becomes increasingly bitter. Newton uses his position as president of the Royal Society to stack investigations in his favor, to damage Leibniz's reputation, to ensure history remembers him as the sole inventor. It's petty beneath someone of his stature, but Newton can't let it go. The need for recognition, for control, for vindication, these drive him as much at 80 as they did at 23. He's the man who explained the cosmos, who revealed the mathematical structure of reality, yet he's still insecure, still wounded by slights real and imagined, still fighting battles that diminished both combatants. The man deciphered the universe but not his own heart. This is the tragedy beneath the triumph. Newton achieved intellectual mastery unprecedented in human history, but emotional mastery eluded him. He understood gravity, optics, mathematics, celestial mechanics. He couldn't understand himself, couldn't overcome his anger and paranoia, couldn't find peace or connection or love. In his final years, his mind begins to fail. The sharpness dulls. The calculations become harder. Memory fades. He's still revered, still consulted on scientific matters, but his creative period is long past. Everything significant was done by his mid-40s. The last decades are devoted to protecting his legacy, ensuring proper credit, refining rather than discovering. He dies in March 1727, after suffering severe pain from his kidney condition. His final weeks are agonizing, but he faces death with characteristic stoicism. His last recorded words are unremarkable, practical instructions to his niece. No grand pronouncements, no deathbed revelations. He simply stops, as all things eventually do, returning to the earth whose pull he explained so perfectly. Voltaire, visiting England soon after Newton's death, attends the funeral and is profoundly moved. In France, scientists and philosophers are ignored or persecuted. In England, Newton receives a state funeral, buried among royalty. Voltaire writes, "I have seen a professor of mathematics simply because he was great in his vocation, buried like a king who had benefited his subjects." The contrast impressed him, reinforced his conviction that England was more enlightened than France, that honor accorded to intellect was a mark of civilized society. But the honor and ceremony don't capture the reality. Newton's life was difficult, often painful, marked by brilliance but also by isolation and inner turmoil. The solitude that enabled his discoveries also condemned him to loneliness. The intensity that drove his achievements also drove away human connection. The mind that could comprehend the universe couldn't find happiness, couldn't rest, couldn't be satisfied. Reflection on solitude as the engine of creation pervades his story. Would Newton have made his discoveries without the forced isolation of the plague years? Almost certainly not. The environment at Cambridge was structured, social, full of obligations and distractions. At Woolsthorpe he had freedom, silence, unlimited time to think. The isolation allowed his mind to range freely, to pursue problems without interruption, to achieve the focus necessary for breakthrough insights. But isolation extracted a price. It reinforced tendencies toward paranoia and mistrust. It prevented the development of social skills and emotional intelligence. It created a man who could revolutionize physics but couldn't maintain friendships, who could calculate planetary orbits but couldn't navigate human relationships. The genius and the damage were inseparable, products of the same circumstances, consequences of the same personality traits. Was it worth it? That's the wrong question. It happened. Newton's isolation produced insights that transformed civilization, enabling technologies that benefit billions. But it also produced a man who died alone, who never knew romantic love, who spent his final years fighting petty battles rather than finding peace. Both outcomes were real. Both mattered. The universe gained knowledge. One man gained nothing but knowledge, which wasn't enough to make him happy. The metaphor of the falling apple and the rising mind captures something essential. An apple falls to earth, following the law of gravity, descending as all material things must. A mind rises, transcending material limitations, reaching toward understanding, achieving heights of comprehension that seem to defy the very laws it describes. The contrast is poignant. We are physical beings, subject to gravity, aging, death, yet consciousness allows us to understand these very limitations, to describe mathematically the forces that constrain us. Newton's apple falls, but his equations ascend, outliving him by centuries, spreading across the world, enabling achievements he never imagined. The trajectory is bittersweet. The man dies, forgotten except by historians and physicists. The work lives, embedded in every technology, every spacecraft, every calculation involving motion and force. Which matters more? Both. Neither. They're inseparable aspects of human endeavor, the mortal creator and the immortal creation. Every time something falls, we remember that someone, amid a plague, dared to look upward. Not just physically upward at the moon and stars, but intellectually upward toward understanding, toward principles, toward laws that transcend individual phenomena. Newton looked at a falling apple and saw not just an apple but a window into the structure of reality. That act of imagination, of connecting the commonplace with the cosmic, exemplifies humanity at its best. The courage that requires shouldn't be underestimated. To claim that you, a mortal human, can understand the universe, that nature's secrets are accessible to reason and mathematics, that the heavens obey laws you can discover and verify, this was breathtaking arrogance or breathtaking ambition depending on perspective. Newton had that audacity. He believed human minds were adequate to the task of comprehending creation. And he was right. Not completely, not finally, but sufficiently. We can understand much. We have understood much. The project Newton began continues, generation after generation, each contributing pieces to an emerging picture of reality. We're not finished. Mysteries remain. But the conviction that mysteries are solvable, that nature is comprehensible, that patient investigation reveals truth, this comes from Newton and those like him who dared to think the universe could be known. Progress doesn't always emerge from the noise of empires, from public spectacles or collective movements. Sometimes it comes from silence, from a single mind working alone, from someone who withdraws from the world to understand it better. Newton's most productive period was his most isolated, the plague years at Woolsthorpe, when he had nothing but time and problems and his own formidable intelligence. This raises uncomfortable questions. How much should we celebrate solitary genius? Does emphasizing Newton's isolation diminish the collaborative nature of science, the countless people who contributed to creating conditions that made his work possible? Yes, probably. Science is always more collaborative than the mythology of lone geniuses suggests. Newton built on Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, countless others. His discoveries required instruments and observations others made, mathematical techniques others developed, philosophical frameworks others established. But it's also true that certain insights require deep, uninterrupted focus that only isolation provides. The synthesis Newton achieved, connecting terrestrial and celestial mechanics through universal gravitation, demanded holding immense complexity in mind simultaneously, seeing patterns across disparate phenomena, making conceptual leaps that required both preparation and inspiration. That happened in his head, alone, during the silent months at Woolsthorpe. The world raged outside. Plague killed thousands. Political and religious conflicts tore nations apart. Economic systems collapsed. Terror and uncertainty dominated daily life. And in the midst of all that chaos, one young man sat in a farmhouse calculating the motion of the moon, experimenting with prisms, inventing mathematics, laying foundations for future centuries. The contrast is stark, almost absurd. While civilization seemed to be ending, the seeds of its greatest triumphs were being planted. This is the human story Newton embodies, fragility and power intertwined. We're vulnerable to disease, dependent on circumstances we don't control, mortal and limited. But we're also capable of transcendent achievement, of understanding that outlasts our bodies, of insights that echo through centuries. Newton was abandoned by his mother, threatened by plague, limited by 17th century technology. He also explained the cosmos. The progress born from that isolated mind while the world burned outside his window continues today in laboratories and observatories, in classrooms and spacecraft, wherever humans pursue understanding of the natural world. We're still standing on his shoulders, still using tools he created, still following paths he pioneered. The plague years at Woolsthorpe, those 18 months of forced isolation, produced more lasting value than most empires achieve in centuries. That's not romanticizing suffering or suggesting isolation is necessary for achievement. It's recognizing a historical fact. Sometimes in specific circumstances with particular individuals, solitude enables insights that crowds prevent. Newton needed quiet to hear the universe speak in mathematics. He needed freedom from obligation to pursue problems to their solutions. He needed time, unstructured and unlimited, to let his mind explore without deadlines or demands. We can't, shouldn't try to replicate those conditions. But we can remember what they produced, honor the achievement while acknowledging the cost, and recognize that progress comes from unexpected places and unexpected ways. Sometimes from collaboration and collective effort. Sometimes from isolated individuals wrestling with problems in silence. Both matter. Both contribute. Newton's story is singular, but its lessons are universal. Curiosity, persistence, courage to question received wisdom, willingness to pursue truth wherever it leads. The falling apple and the rising understanding, the plague and the breakthrough, the isolation and the revolution, these opposites define Newton's most important years. They define human progress more broadly. We build toward understanding through periods of darkness, find insight amid suffering, create meaning from chaos. Not always, not guaranteed, but possible. Newton proved it possible. That's the legacy that matters most. Not the equations, though they're magnificent. Not the technology, though it's transformative. The legacy is the proof that humans can understand their universe, that reason and observation are adequate to the task, that we're not condemned to ignorance. Every generation since has stood on that foundation and reached higher. Newton reached from medieval superstition toward Enlightenment reason. Einstein reached from Newtonian mechanics toward relativistic spacetime. Hawking reached from classical physics toward quantum gravity. The progression continues, each generation building on previous insights, each discovery revealing new mysteries, each answer generating new questions. The project is unfinished, will perhaps always be unfinished. But it proceeds. And it began in crucial ways in a farmhouse in Lincolnshire while a young man watched apples fall and wondered why.